Alan from mecha1 at YouTube here with another Let's Build series with a mecha musume custom kit bash build. This build's going to be inspired by Konami's Shimada Hamikane, the guy who practically created mecha musume and strike witches by using a woman in a military style outfit with actual matching mechanical attire. This build's going to be a lot more involved than my last mecha musume build on this channel, which was just a loose figure and spare parts mounted on it. We're going to put a lot more effort in having a very unique and very controlled design. I'll be using an Airfix Male Mark 1 style tank, a fair amount of styrene for scratch building, and a large host of tools. The 72nd scale or the Airfix 76 scale is ideal as their size does match the standard Bandai or anime gashapon figure scale. And the best thing about Airfix is, besides their very low price of under $10, they've been reissued and remade to have far superior moulding techniques and better fitting parts, plus looking quite good. The instruction sheet's very clear, and truth be told, Airfix does make very nice kits for beginners if you are looking into the military genre, as long as they are the newer kits. I've had no problems putting this kit together, minimum seam lines and minimum effort in actual building or painting. Back to the build, and I promise this will be a very lengthy video, so stay tuned for the ride. I'll be building the two side tracks and the two side turrets in order by the instructions, which I'll later be ditching and assembling appropriately. I did choose the male tank over the female tank, as the female tank has two very small machine guns and not very noticeable or effective in this scale. These larger naval cannons are a lot more threatening. Unlike the original release of Airfix kits, I found these to be completely retooled. They fit very well, glue very well, the fitting's just fantastic. It's almost on par with higher manufacturers like your Tamiyas, Hasegawas and Bandais. Throw in fantastic crisp detail, lots of rivets, lots of deep panel lines, and also takes hand painting well. I'm going to be using Airfix as scratch building fodder for a long time to come. You just can't beat small kits for under $10. It's just absolutely amazing. Right now we're going to be covering these holes for the turrets, so I'm incorporating 1 mil styrene sheets, or what a lot of people know it as is plow plate, but this stuff's not made by Tamiya. Just simple measure up with a ruler and a texture, and I'll be cutting this out with standard scissors, none of this knife bending business. When you're gluing styrene sheet to styrene plastic surfaces, plastic cement works perfectly well. It's all the same material and bonds the same. Just be careful if you are attaching styrene to other surfaces such as resin or metals, you will use superglue. Before we get off track with a lot of mecha musume armor designs, I'm going to try to incorporate as much as this tank design onto this jumpsuit figure. So there's going to be lots of trimming down and cutting down of parts to be more compact, and at the same time I have to scratch build armored legs for this build. So I'm definitely pushing my imagination into hyperdrive, but being a World War I technology, I can be a lot bulkier and clumsier about it. A really important tool in this sort of building is a fine-tooth reliable saw. You will be cutting a lot of things, and you have to make sure double or triple check when you are cutting parts, as if you cut too much off, things get a bit sticky when you're gluing things together. I will only be painting the armor parts and not the figure parts, so I don't want to be causing any damage to that. At the moment I've completely disregarded the instructions for the old Mark 1, and I've removed the bottom part of the tank and chopping it in half to be dressing for the legs I will be scratch building. Now, every piece we do chop down, it's going to have some rough edges, so filing and sanding will be necessary to keep everything neat and nice as possible. As we are building a model kit, we want to make the whole thing look like it's one functioning item in the real world, even though it's a bizarre fantasy object. Another handy element to scratch building is as many thicknesses of sheets and rods of styrene as you can humanly get your hands on and can afford. It's quite easy of just marking the length you want, chopping it about 1/3 in, and it snaps very easily due to the softness of the material. With a wide variety of material shapes and sizes, you have a wide variety of choices in the ease of scratch building instead of using putties or multiple layers of sheeting on top of each other. This job's a lot easier, and we've got a very unique set of legs, a bit of putty, and she's looking like one piece out of an actual model kit or toy. Also remember, when scratch building, cutting, sanding, putting pieces, you need to be as neat as humanly possible or it will all show through your paintwork. The illusion of scratch building and having your unique model is to be as neat and one piece looking as possible. Dremel, always a useful tool again. I'm going to be flattening the clothing folds underneath her breasts to add some armor plating. Again, with your scratch building staple and infantry, it's always handy to have a very large bits box where you're able to trim down parts a bit further and almost get any sort of detail you desire. I'm trying to be as neat as humanly possible here because I do not want to repaint the actual elements of the figure, particularly flesh areas. So once I've perfectly marked out and sanded down the area that I desire for the armor plating, I'm going to buffer it between the body and the armor piecing with some 2-part green stuff putty. All this will be painted close to the clothing and it will look like one piece. To attach the putty and part to the actual body, I'm using super glue, but only very small light dabs, again to keep the body of the figure neat as possible. In regards to spare parts, all the parts on this kit besides styrene material will be out of the model. I'd like to try to utilize as many pieces I humanly can with this particular build, but it's not vital or important for other builds, or let's say your builds, if you wish to follow this style of work in your own repertoire. For smaller pieces while cutting, a heavy duty pair of nippers that you would use on resin or metal kits is also very popular. At the moment some of the pieces are taking shape and we can see a direction roughly where this model is heading. Now you guys know I'm not absolutely mad and just randomly slapping bits and pieces together, which, to tell the truth, I slightly was, with at least a minor plan in mind. With the two sides of the tank done, a basic understanding of the legs or the ability for the figure to stand, we're ready to add some rubber tracks to our tank to add the tank to the legs. Traditionally you would wrap these rubber tracks all the way around the tank and put the two tabs together and heat the grooves with a flathead screwdriver dipped in fire or some sort of lighter and melt it together. This is quite flimsy and we'll be using super glue for a lot more stable fit. Another thing you might be worried about the rubber tracks is paint won't stick to it. Don't fear, once it's all glued down you are able to prime it with lacquer and any sort of paint will be able to sit on top. You do not have to be conservative with the super glue. Make sure to put plenty on so it has no loose or weak bits anywhere around that could future tear off. Nice even coat all around will work, and this is a very good fitting tracks to this particular model. Kind of reminds me of a Warhammer 40k tank. Now, because these tank pieces are going to be sitting on an angle around the legs, we need to address these gaping gaps where the turrets are, since we did cut them down. Best course of action is 2-part putty. I'll be using Milliput, which is very cheap from England and a very popular scratch building medium For scale modelling, cut 2 equal parts and mix them together. We'll just be ramming in the holes, which they do adhere to different surfaces, and sculpt the surfaces with a toothpick. They do dry around 8, 12 to 24 hours. Now, once fully hardened, milliput can be sanded, drilled, cut and whatever, but if you're particularly neat with it, which you do have a very long hardening time, you can get the ideal shape straight away. Afterwards, or once it does harden, I'm also super gluing some extra detail around here. I do not want to permanently glue the tank sides to the legs, so I've got ease of detailing later, or painting, so I'll be utilising magnets yet again in my style of modelling. It is important in this stage, and really all the stages, to test fit to make sure it's positioned correctly, so I know where to mark and glue the magnets. You make sure you glue one side of the magnet down, wait until it dries, and then test fit the other side, because if you reverse the polarity of the magnets, they will detract from each other instead of actually sticking together. So take your time with gluing the magnets, and test fitting throughout the entire build is absolutely important, even though I'm not showing those stages in this video to cut down on time. At this stage, I'm assessing where to go next. The figure doesn't stand on its own, which is okay. I'm going to have to start building some secondary support part, which I'll be using those large wheels you see on the back of the Mark 1 and a hip of suspension. Also, at this stage, it's a good idea to start kneading up some of the extra panels and dressing around the actual legs and armour with putty, since there is gaping gaps. Scratch building parts don't just magically fit together. You need to force it to fit, and putty does fill in the trick. I'm using Squadron, which eats into the plastic and sticks nicely. Once dry, always sand, or you'll be left with a horrible texture. Right now I'm detailing the leg areas, since there's a lot of plain detail, and I've got all sorts of lovely bits of detail, such as suspension springs, small panels, small hatches, large dip areas for the back of the kneecaps. Just trying to look a little functional, but at the same time just having fun and giving some very interesting areas to look at and paint. Out of all seriousness, I consider this to be the most fun of the build, and if you remember my last mecha musume figure, it was actually all about gluing small detail bits onto a figure, and not a lot of this large, difficult scratch building business. With all that assembled, all attached with plastic cement and filed and kneaded together when cut off the sprues, I've got a very nice detailed back area. The next point is building myself some supports for the back of the tank, so the tank sides can be in an angle with minimal track touching the ground. I'll be switching the original Mark 1 design by swapping the side of this support bracket for the axle and the wheels. It's a delicate process of cutting the center up, but due to the brittle and weakness of the styrene, I will be supporting it with more plastic strips, very delicately, and trying to get the illusion of one really big wheel at the back instead of two tandem ones in the center of the two tank tracks and being connected by the axle. I was really fascinated by the design of this particular tank. I've never built a model from the World War 1 era, yet I've always been really interested in the armour, which is a very important development in tank technology today. The rear wheels almost look like it's been ripped straight off a horse and wagon, and the rest of the body's just so bizarre and interesting looking. The rigging of the supports and wheels have been added. It's glued on and reinforced with super glue and all together. Yet I royally fucked up and she doesn't fit, which is not a problem. Back to the drawing board and straight into some cutting and sanding, and keep going until this guy does fit. While scratch building, you'll always come up with dead ends or not sure how to get around certain structural or engineering problems. I'm quite lucky, as in this build this is my absolute worst fault, but for little thinking and heavy thoughts into it, you can eventually get around it, and sometimes you may need to purchase or build something to go through your problems. You just keep at it and things will work together as it should. Now I have my basic design standing proudly. All I have to do is neaten her up and keep detailing until I'm happy, and now I'm cutting up some extra supports and armor to dress the inner parts of the tank tracks. I don't have a lot of small detail left over, so I'm getting larger armor bits that are used for the center top canopy of the driver part of the tank. I've chopped them down to the sizes that will fit in the very weird and unique areas and gluing them down. Just a little bit of measurement and cutting. Also, with the scratch built part of the supports for the wheel, I'm gluing some suspension and extra detail to blend in this styrene scratch built area with the rest of the build and make it as natural as possible in the nature of this item. Once I'm happy with the static detail and the general look of the entire figure, which she's done now and looking alright to the style of the actual armor attached to this figure, there will be some extra rough areas or gaps that you do have to putty, like your seam lines on your kit, and we're able to move on to our next area. Very surprisingly with this build, as I'm a slow builder, this project came together very quickly in 2 weeks, and the general design I had in my mind was very close to what is right in front of me here. Now we're up to the painting stage, and of course with everything I paint in my style and what I recommend, the priming process goes first. I only want to paint the armor parts and not the figure itself, as I've said a few times, so everything will be hand painted. Of course we can hand paint with primer and lacquer, which we do have to thin with lacquer thinner and apply with a brush. Very carefully with a fine point brush, which we should take care of, not leaving it in the jar and all the old rules, and keeping the tip neat using our fingers once cleaning. We're only going to be painting the very edge between the figure and the mechanical detail, and later on colour everything else in with a larger brush. This job is extremely tedious to do, a very neat job, as the paint is very thin to prevent streaking, and a couple of coats is required. Of course, as the lazy bastard I am cheating slightly by airbrushing the primer onto the tank tracks, as they're not yet attached to the figure, but for the challenge I will be painting the rest of the colour and camouflage by hand. The box and instructions are very clear on the camouflage and painting scheme of this kit, which I'll be sticking to the original. I want this kit to represent the original Mark 1 tank as much as possible in its historical look, while the craziness of a girl attached to it. It will be painted with acrylics from Gunzi and Tamir, as closely matched as humanly possible to the scheme. Normally you would use enamel Humbrol as recommended by the manufacturer. This stage should only be attempted once the primer has dried, as leftover thinner will eat into the overlay of the acrylic. Same story goes, use a fine tip brush well kept to do the edging and colour everything in with the lightest paint colour possible. I am slightly diluting the paint for larger surfaces with water, a poor man method. For smaller detail, acrylic paint normally sits on quite well unthinned. Explaining what I'm doing right here, and this technique does work on most models. Thinning with water and paint and applying it to the surface, it looks very, very blotchy, very scrambled, quite an ugly look, but when you're brushing across, it's very smooth flowing and you won't get any streaks or strange effects. It will take time to dry, but once fully dried you can do this a second or third time, again thinning the paint down quite a bit, and once it builds up via a few layers you'll get an almost airbrush look of a very flat paint job. Of course, if you're doing this technique with isopropyl alcohol, the correct thinner for these acrylic paints, it'll be a lot easier and effective. The only issue with my technique with the water, you might have different finish streaks of gloss, but since we're top coating this anyway, that's not an issue. Of course, between layers I'm allowing 12 hours for it to fully dry and mature before I layer the next paint. With this light tan fully dried, I'm going for the next colour recommended by the instruction sheet, which is a camouflage pattern. I'm doing a freehand, my own style, loosely based off the same pattern of the instructions. I'm doing the outlines with a fine tip brush, and we'll colour in those areas with straight paint, smoothing as much as I can with a touch of water or thinner once the paint's been laid out to iron out streaks. Now this technique only works again with a very well kept, very soft brush. It is very tedious, it does take a very long time. The biggest mistake I used to do when I started hand painting and everybody else is rushing and trying to get the model covered as quick as possible. Another big problem, once you've been airbrushing for a very long time, you learn that models coverage is very quick, and once you go back to the hand painting, the time you spend just covering small details is just absolutely mind-numbing, and you wonder why you've ever stopped airbrushing in the first place. But unfortunately I do have my problem and I don't wish to mask. It's good to return every now and then. Now we have the armour painted with its multi-tone camouflage. We're able to do detail like tank tracks, the gun barrel and the cloth between the turret and tank, which funnily enough was never incorporated in the original design of the Mark 1, but needed it to occur for the layout and shape of this model. With this such a crazy concept, I am taking in artistic license. Plus we're not subject or military modelers, so screw all the rules. I'm not going to do the competitions unless it's a shit stir, which you know I'm going to do it. Our kit's appropriately painted. She's looking very sexy. The armor's looking quite nice, but it's still kind of 2D and flat. We've got some nice detail in rivets and panel lines provided by Airfix, so weathering is required. And we're going to be looking at a sludge wash, which a tutorial has been done a while ago, and dry brushing. I'm going to attach a tutorial video straight after this video working on this kit, so please check it out. Also, unfortunately, with some of the paints I use, the protective top coat and wash, it's also in the incorrect finish of being kind of glossy and mega glossy in some areas. We'll be providing some flat top coat, thinning down some Tamiya flat with a lot of thinner, and getting it into a nice non-gloss look. Painting's all completely done, and the armor bits on the actual body had to be tightly airbrushed and excess wiped off with a Q-tip and methylated spirits. The actual gashapon figure itself is kind of loose in some areas, so they need to be super glued in and assembled. At this stage I felt that this is one of these long-term builds, and putting the final pieces together and just standing back and seeing how it basically looks and stands out, I'm really pleased. Being my own design and just kit bashing the thing together into one piece in something that I'm pretty pleased with her. I admit to having an absolute ton of fun building her. There was no stress or worry while putting it together. It's pretty much just kept messing around with tools and parts and just kept playing until I've got something. The figure is very cute. I love this. She's sitting in my cabinet with my more nicer built models. I don't have a relationship with the character. I found her on eBay for about $4, including shipping from China. It's an original actual figure. The model itself cost me around $8, so it was a very cheap project and I used most of the parts. I definitely do and plan on taking this kit to some displays and traditional military model competitions to freak out some armor heads and rivet counters. That part will also be a lot of fun. I recommend everybody having a go at making a mecha musume kit. Ton of fun. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time, hope you guys are still loving these long videos. See you later.